Hi, welcome. My name is Beret Norman. I'm an associate professor of German at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho. I teach intermediate through advanced levels of language, literature, and culture. Today I've chosen the title Art in 2020, Connecting Self-Portraits from the 1920s to Today, because I believe looking at, discussing, and making our own art can help in times of uncertainty. And art in the language classroom can present a meaningful way to incorporate multiple proficiency-related skills. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that my university is on the traditional lands of the Shoshone-Bannock and Shoshone-Paiute. Looking back 100 years to another time of uncertainty, this presentation establishes the background and suggests a unit plan that focuses on German artists' use of self-portraits in the 1920s. It can be expanded geographically, linguistically, and culturally. Students will implement all 4 language skills in this unit, focusing specifically on presentational writing and reflection that correspond with the creation of their own self-portrait and writing an artist statement. I stepped through some images that address a socio-historical context leading up to the 1920s in Germany, in other words, post-World War I and the time of political, social, and cultural upheaval. And I connect this to today's current situation filled with anxieties. I will also provide an overview of self-portraits by looking at famous world artists' self-portraits. Then I'll focus on one self-portrait by the German artist Hannah Hirsch and step through the suggested unit. I've included the shortened URL address of the Google Doc for this unit, which you may access. It's at the bottom of your screen. I hope thus to open up the topic of community by looking first at oneself and how one can use self-portraits as an interpersonal communication tool, and then as a means of dialogue by sharing self-portraits in a classroom online exhibit space like Artsonia. Participants can expect these 2 outcomes: exploring to design units that use written and visual authentic text to interpret and infer meaning from self-portraits, and exploring how to design units to identify, quote, community, end quote, and compare historic and contemporary use of self-portraits. So why this title, 2020? It is common knowledge that 2020 refers to visual acuity. The first number means your distance from an eye chart, and the second is the size of the letter you can read. So I turn this a bit and think about art in 2020 for a language unit is really looking at self-representations in a certain time, 1920 and 2020. What is our visual acuity for 100 years ago? Do we see things clearly? The distance of 100 years and so many sources of information about that time in books, documentaries, statistics may help us with factual information, but our knowledge of the extraordinary context, especially of a person's position and outlook, may remain unclear. Art can help as we interpret meaning and intent. I suggest we use the 2020 guide with the hopes of looking back, if not with accuracy, then with curiosity, and with an attempt to focus our gaze, while also looking at ourselves today. This seems worthwhile as we are now in another extraordinary context, albeit very different from 100 years ago, but one also with uncertainty and possibility. Looking back then, I discuss one example of German artist Hannah Hirsch. Hirsch is mostly known for what is called photo montage, a collage constructed from photographs, but she has several interesting self-portraits that use photography, and she was very actively producing art in 1919 and throughout the 1920s, so 100 years ago. Part of the reason I thought this topic of self-portraits would resonate with learners is that we have such a selfie society today. Taking one's photograph is extremely common. I use this self-portrait of a person in a mirror found on Susie Hazelwood's Pexels site, which is free to use images, to suggest a deeper look than just the reflection of appearance. What does a photograph, even a selfie, say about the artist's message and the artist's context? And in a time of COVID-19 and self-isolation, I think even young learners can benefit from a reflection about how they want to present themselves and their context during this time. Looking back with 2020 vision, we find a time of great uncertainty and a time of disease 100 years ago too. For purposes of time, I focus on Europe and Germany today, but the difficulties in the early years of the 20th century also resonate globally. Looking at Europe, the 4 years of World War I end in November 1918. A new republic without a monarch is proclaimed for Germany. The Treaty of Versailles is signed in 1919 with severe reparations for Germany. Austria has a separate treaty. And during the time of a great war, there was also the influenza epidemic. The Centers for Disease Control states that there were, quote, at least 50 million deaths worldwide, end quote, due to this H1N1 virus pandemic. 100 years later, we still have armed conflicts in the world. And we have a global pandemic. I suggest students can make connections to 100 years ago in the current context of the pandemic and the ubiquitous use of selfies today. Self-portraits can serve as a practical step. An all too brief overview of self-portraits in art history can assist us as we help our students make these connections. The earliest known self-portrait in European art is from 527 years ago by the German artist Albrecht Dürer. I have links to all of these images and often with much more detailed commentary about each self-portrait in the Google Doc. In the second self-portrait of Dürer's 5 years later, scholars point out how Dürer insists on his dignity. Perhaps Dürer's most famous self-portrait is this, which he painted before his 29th birthday. In it, one sees his resemblance to Jesus Christ, what scholars describe not as blasphemy, but as, quote, a statement of faith, end quote, showing that Dürer's skills were a, quote, God-given talent, end quote. More than 100 years after Dürer's famous self-portraits, we find one of the most prolific painters of self-portraits, Dutch artist Rembrandt van Rijn. In his self-portraits, Rembrandt documents, quote, a human and artistic self-examination lasting a lifetime. You'll find the sources for these quotes on the About section. Moving into the 19th century, French painter Gustave Courbet provides us with social statements. Here, Courbet is in a prison due to his political activities at the end of the Second French Empire. Around this time, Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh was also busy with self-portraits, several from inside the Asylum Saint-Remy. One self-portrait that has always interested me is this by German painter Lovis Corinth on the eve of the turn of the 20th century. It certainly has a reference to death with the skeleton at the artist's eye level. Moving into the time frame of the 100 years ago, we find Mexican artist Frida Kahlo's early self-portraits. She said the famous line, quote, I paint self-portraits because I am the person that I know best. I paint my own reality, end quote. I will quickly show a few more international artists' works from this time period. Here is Spanish painter Joan Miró, Italian sculptor and painter Amedeo Modigliani, who died of tubercular meningitis in Paris in 1920. Thus, this is 1 year before his death at age 35. Chinese painter Chu Beihong wanted to modernize painting in China. He traveled to Japan, France, and Germany. Another Chinese painter, Pan Yuliang, was the first woman in China to paint in the Western style. Moving back to focus on Germany, we remember the self-portrait with a skeleton by Corinth. Here we see one of his self-portrait sketches, but in our time period. Students might like to try sketching instead of painting or photography. I would be remiss if I did not mention some of the biggest names of German painters in the 1920s. Certainly Max Beckmann is one of them. He and the painter Otto Dix both have works that have been categorized as New Objectivity or Neue Sachlichkeit. New Objectivity, quote, frequently portrayed the society in a caustically satirical manner, end quote. I now step away from just looking at paintings and show several photographs. These might resonate more with our students today who enjoy selfies with all kinds of filters. One of the few women in the German art scene was Hannah Hirsch. As I mentioned earlier, she is best known for her work in photo montage, collages that use photographs and other widely used media, but I will focus on her self-portraits that are photographs. Obviously, I would question why the German Dada artist Raoul Hausmann appears here in her self-portrait. Hirsch and Hausmann had a 7-year relationship and both were active in the Berlin Dada scene. Allowing questions to remain, we move on and we will focus on this self-portrait by Hirsch. The use of double exposure in this and the previous self-portrait by Hirsch is the first time in this admittedly brief overview, the first time we see an artist showing layers of self in a self-portrait. I'll discuss this a bit more as I step through the teaching unit using self-portraits. A similar idea of multiple exposures can be seen in this image. I hope our students may stretch their imagination and step away from the traditional selfies in a project like this. Google Arts and Culture has an excellent slideshow with the same title of how the self-portrait evolved into the selfie. The information from this Google Arts and Culture slideshow tells us that our students are most likely already involved in self-portraiture. Quote, every day 93 million selfies are taken all over the world, end quote. I suggest we connect this type of self-reflection with target language production. Here are the main elements in the suggested unit. I've included the shortened URL for the Google Doc too. You will find much more information and all of the links in this Google Doc at the bottom of your screen. In essence, instructors start by using one self-portrait from 100 years ago. Students will listen, read, speak, and write about the artist's self-portrait. See the Google Doc for the ideas of where and how to do this online. And students will create their own self-portrait with ideas and inspiration from it. I suggest students follow concrete examples from the beginning stages of such a unit's implementation. For instance, here, students could be asked to create their own double exposure of a selfie. But students can also research sketches of self-portraits and of course let them create their own painted, sketched, or photographed self-portraits. Information about the practical pedagogical steps is in the Google Doc. Moving from the individual isolated due to COVID-19 restrictions, we move to an online space as a way for the community to come together. I suggest the students share their self-portraits in a digital exhibit in, for instance, the Artsonia app, where students each create a digital platform where they place their digitized versions of their self-portraits and their artist statements. The Artsonia app is free and its digital portfolio has an artist statement feature already in it. Another option is Seesaw, also free. It has a creative canvas and a drawing tool. Students can use the Seesaw app on phones, iPads, and Chromebooks. The artist statement is a significant aspect of this unit. An educator from San Francisco, Matt Christensen, has written an article that can be transferred into the language unit. Early learners can list words, more advanced learners can write connecting paragraphs. They are all evaluating, and they focus on message, intent, story, and reflection. In this unit, we can focus on more than just a selfie. We probe more higher level thinking and use self-portraits by established artists in the language classroom. We hereby examine intercultural competencies, discussing historical artists and their contexts, connecting the idea of self-representation to the social and historical context. Using self-portraits in the language classroom helps students on several learning levels. They describe a specific image and interpret the artist's intention. They reproduce a method or type of self-portrait, and through written reflection, both explain what they mean and what the social context is, and they justify why they chose to create their self-portrait or selfie in this way. Such art-based units, which use creativity and self-reflection, assist language learners to remain curious. We all improve our vision when we see things from 1920 or from today more clearly, and sharing our sense of self, even in the early stages of language learning, can build community despite our distance. Thank you.